Hey everybody, Tim Anderson here, aka Renville. Welcome back. We're going to be talking more Tolkien and Middle Earth today, but rather than just kind of keeping the topic around the Rings of Power, today I actually want to dive into something that's a little more deeper. It's a little more Tolkien, and that is, was Tolkien a racist? Because I see all these people trying to claim that he was and saying that his works were problematic and that he was a misogynist, and that's why Amazon needs to make the story more modern because Tolkien only had white people because he hated blacks and he hated, anyone who wasn't white. But yet, I read these books growing up and read them my whole life, and I never once got the impression that Tolkien was a racist, which begs the question, was he a racist? Or am I a racist because I didn't see the racism in his work? There's so many questions here at play. I want to dive into this today, so that's what this topic is going to be about. Now, if this is your first time here and you haven't ever watched any of my other videos before, and you get to the end of this and you like it, I'd love it if you hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon if you'd like to get more, and don't forget to check out the other Rings of Power discussions and Tolkien discussions that we are having here on the channel if that is why you're here. And don't forget, we have a Discord. Links are down below if you'd like to have greater conversations with us or join our gaming community and beyond. So, without further ado, let's dive into today's topic. Now, first and foremost, I should say that I am not a Tolkien scholar. I am just someone who loves Middle Earth. I love the Hobbit books. I read The Hobbit when I was 5 years old. I read The Lord of the Rings when I was seven for the first time, read it again when I was 9 years old for a second time, and then by the time I was 12, I was reading The Lord of the Rings every single year, sort of as an obsession, kind of like watching Star Wars every year when I was growing up, all the way up until I was around 20, 21 years old, and that was the last time that I read it annually. I haven't read Lord of the Rings, very long time. It's been at least a decade, I think, since I've read the books through, and I haven't read the Silmarillion in probably 15 years at least. So it's been a very long time, but I do know a lot about it and have good memories about all these books, but that does not necessarily make me a scholar or an expert. I'm just someone who loves Tolkien, loves Middle Earth, and so I'm very confused by all of these discussions. So I've been doing some digging. Now, for better or for worse, I'm going to be sharing some links, some things that I've been reading through. I don't know how accurate any of these sources are, so feel free to correct me down in the links below if you think that my sources aren't the greatest. But I went and I've been doing some reading the past couple of hours on racism in Tolkien's works, and the Tolkien Gateway seems to have a pretty good page with a lot of good information here, and we're going to be diving into some of it. Um, there's a quote here at the beginning from David Abad of the Chicago Tribune, which says, "For years, Tolkien scholars have waged a fight on two fronts against an academic establishment that for the most part refused to take the author's work seriously and against white supremacists who have tried to claim the professor as one of their own." And there's some really good information in here that I've looked at, and especially when they talk about and I've got the digital versions of the Lord of the Rings, and in the forward, yes, Tolkien strongly cautioned against viewing any of his works as an allegory, saying that he disliked allegory himself. And according to his own claims, he denounced Hitler, Nazi beliefs, race doctrine, and apartheid, and praised the Jews, calling them a gifted people. So one could say that Tolkien, therefore, can be described as an author whose messages, allegories, or lack thereof, and agendas are being set aside from the social political domain and then entirely focused within a fantasy fiction context. Now, this is something that I talked about yesterday or this morning, I forget, in a stream where I was talking about, as someone who creates fantasy worlds, I've been a writer for a very long time. I always try to put something of the real world into the works that I'm creating because everything we're doing is based on something, right? So whether it's geographical in nature or something that we associate with because that's what we grew up and that's what we know, we always infuse our works with something that is known to us, regardless of who we are as a writer, a painter, a musician, or so on and so forth. And when you're creating fantastical worlds, no matter how much you want to imagine and how creative you get with your imagination, there are always going to be reference points that can be made to real life scenarios. And I often feel that this isn't a good thing in the sense that when you're leaving something up to interpretation, people will oftentimes take that out of context because they're going to apply their own interpretation to it based on their own personal backgrounds, upbringings, so on and so forth. So it's very tricky, and that's why I appreciate the fact that what's at least said here is that Tolkien can be described as an author whose messages, etc., um, were set aside from social political domain and were entirely focused within a fantasy fiction context. That's very important to me because we're talking about a fantastical world, not something based in our own real world. And if you go watch the video I did on is race important in Middle Earth, I have a very hard time believing anyone or giving credibility to anyone who wants to try to take our real world politics and policies and racism issues and put them into a work of fiction because I don't think that they apply. Now, I've read some, it's just in the course of today doing some research and reading, diving into this topic a little bit deeper. One of my favorites here was this, it's called bookriot.com. And again, I don't know. Um, much about this place. It's just an article that I read and it made me chuckle because of something. And I was like, where are they getting this from? Um, like their first outbound link here is to Quora.com, which is not a reputable source of information whatsoever. But it's this article about the time J.R.R. Tolkien told some racists to suck a lemon, and they talk about him replying to some German publishers and telling them basically to get bent. But my favorite thing from this is which because I don't know where this came from. It says here Tolkien wasn't always so complimentary towards Jewish people. His methods of incorporating Jewishness into his books were often unenlightened. In The Hobbit of all places, Gandalf describes dwarves as calculating folk with a great idea of the value of money. Some are tricky and treacherous and pretty bad lots. It says, this is considerably less cool of you, Mr. Tolkien, sir. In fact, it sounds a whole lot like the kind of lies that Germany was selling about the race of gifted people Tolkien so eloquently defended in his letter to Reuben and Lowen. So then that led me down a deeper rabbit hole of the freelibrary.com, which apparently has a link to some um, letters letters and interviews that Tolkien gave over the years, where he apparently said that dwarves were like Jews and made some allegories between them. And again, I don't know the authenticity of this stuff because I'm not a Tolkien scholar. So all I can say is that from the time I was a kid up until this year, this very year, from the time, I was 5 years old when I first read The Hobbit. It would have been 1985. I was born in 80. So I first read The Hobbit in 1985. I didn't get any racism out of that whatsoever. Over the years, as I've read Lord of the Rings, the only racism that I've ever seen is obviously you've got some tension between the dwarves and the elves. And that's about it. And that's based on past issues with some decisions that were made on either side, but it had nothing to do, very important here, nothing to do with skin color and everything to do with the interracial relations. And I always come back to how everything we have on planet Earth, if you think about, what is the human race, and I am of that opinion that the human race includes everyone who is a human being on planet Earth. It doesn't matter your skin color. We are all human beings, therefore we are all part of the human race. So I have a hard time with anyone who tries to justify any type of racism on planet Earth because all human beings are equal in my mind. We are all equals. Doesn't matter where you're born, skin color, everything. We all bleed the same blood, etc. So when I read Tolkien's works, and when I read Tolkien's works today, I don't see racism portrayed like people are trying to accredit him. I see things on, dwarves versus elves, but that to me doesn't mean anything. It doesn't have anything to do with skin color. Um, they also talk about there's this theory that the orcs are described as like allegories for Japanese people and propaganda related to World War II and so on and so forth. But as I recall, orcs were elves beforehand. They were just corrupted by Melkor. And again, it's just I'm not an expert on these things. I am simply someone who loves Tolkien, and so I'm trying to educate myself. Is really what this video is about. Is me trying to wrap my head around this idea that Tolkien was racist. Because again, when I read The Lord of the Rings, I don't see that. But then they talk about how um, Tolkien made some comments and statements in some letters and interviews about how orcs were squat, broad-faced, flat-nosed, solid-skinned with wide mouths and slant eyes. In fact, degraded and repulsive versions of the, to Europeans, least lovely Mongol types. And they talk about how, well, Tolkien's statement comparing orcs to the Mongol types may be interpreted as racist. He does put a disclaimer that to the Europeans they looked least lovely, which at least they say here recognized Western cultural bias and pointed out that they were the degraded and repulsive versions of Mongol types, not actual Mongol types. Now, I've also heard um, scholars such as Tom Shippey and beyond just outright reject the idea that Tolkien was racist. People, I feel like this often is maybe part of this confirmation bias that we have in today's culture, where if you see something and you think it to be true, then you're always going to find something or a way to interpret something that will confirm your biased opinion. And I personally feel, based on what I know and love around Tolkien's work, that people are trying to put things into his works that don't actually exist there. I'm going to go back real quick. I had somebody comment on one of my videos recently and say something along. I mean, I don't have it because I've been getting. It's literally like 7 or 8 thousand comments over the last 10 days. I can't keep up, but buried in there, there was one that stood out to me because someone basically said that Tolkien was racist because of the time he lived in. It wasn't his fault, but he was absolutely a racist because of the time and place of his birth, the time that he was writing, so on and so forth. He just couldn't help the fact that he was racist. And because of that, we need to correct his works in the modern era. And that makes me scratch my head. I don't get that. Are we also going to go out and need to correct the works of Shakespeare? How about better yet, the Bible? That's a good one for you. If Tolkien's works were racist and misogynist because of the times that they're written, what about the Bible, which talks about slavery and selling your children and murdering people and all this other stuff, and yet we don't see the same labels being applied to the Bible per se. This confuses me, which is why I really am trying to educate myself on this because I just don't see it. I really had a hard time. That person was saying that in my comments, saying that Tolkien was racist because of the time and place he was born. They also said something about the fact that he was racist for writing that light skinned people lived in this part and dark skinned people lived in this part. I'm like, that's just geography. Like when you're making a fantasy world, you're basing some of it on your own real world. And so I've done the same thing in my worlds. You've got, light skinned people live in the north and dark skinned people live in the south. That's just the basic geography of our planet Earth. And it's not necessarily the geography of the fantasy planets that I've created, but you definitely have light skinned people in the cold areas and darker skinned peoples in the hot or desert areas because I'm applying real world science to that. The melanin in our skins reacts to the sun. So if you live in a hot, sunny environment, you get darker as a result. And if you live in a light skinned or cold area and you're constantly bundled up and you're not getting any sun, you're going to look like me because I'm Scandinavian and I can't change that fact of where my ancestors came from or where they lived or things of that nature. So geography, I don't think geography has anything to do with it. So I'm really puzzled by all of this. I would love everybody's thoughts. I really am trying to educate myself on this subject. I don't see Tolkien as a misogynist, racist old white dude. I see that he was trying to create a North European mythology. And I have seen some, and I'm not going to, full disclosure here, I have seen some problematic things in some of his letters and writings, but I've also seen that his opinion on those things changed dramatically over the years as he further educated himself and grew as a writer and an individual. But I don't see any of those things actually in The Lord of the Rings. Those were like, I feel like those were things he might have said, or personal opinions don't always reflect the art that someone is creating, that kind of thing. I am a big believer in separating art from the artist, if that makes sense. I don't know. Love to hear everybody's thoughts. Drop your comments down below. What do you think about this conversation? Beyond that, if you liked what you saw here today, don't forget to smash that like button so you can get a follow along. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon, all those good things so you get more updates like this. Let's continue the conversation, folks, because I am genuinely curious about this and I want to know more. Until next time, stay safe.